To kick off the discussion tonight, the broad topic is the idea of academic research and the relevance of writing a thesis and doing academic research. And I would like to open up, and I want to pose this question to Juliet as our far away guest tonight. Not a newcomer to South Africa by all means, but Juliet, you have a perspective, of course, that's different maybe from the rest of the panel, because you're a professor at your overseas university. Firstly, I would like to ask, how do you do it? Do you still publish things by a big tome, a thesis, whether it's an MA or a PhD thesis, or do you do it by article?
It depends on the student. So for most of our master's theses, they're done by just a fat thesis. Yeah. 70 to 80 pages, so not that big. However, for our PhD students, it depends on the individual professor. So I personally encourage my students to publish during their PhDs. And so then they create what we call a sandwich thesis, which is a compilation of their 3 or 4 articles with a separate introduction and a separate discussion that sandwiches all of it into the thesis. Mm-hmm. But some professors prefer that their students write an entire thesis from scratch without actually inserting their published articles. So the university doesn't have a set policy, it's up to the individual professor. So it differs depending on the professor. Yeah. So
the reason why I kick off with that question is that there's been some debate of, why have this discussion? It's a little bit clear case. In South Africa, you can do it either way,
Right.
So, is it really something to debate? I mean, the real debate then, and I'm looking at you, Sean, but what's the relevance here? Why are we asking these questions? What's the relevance of academic? You've left academia. You're in industry. What's the relevance of academic research?
Well, I think, it's interesting. I mean, for me, it's a bit of a hybrid conversation. I think in the context of 4.0, I think the backdrop of, the world around us is changing. The context is changing, the technology is altering, and is the academic thesis keeping up with higher education as a whole and the academic thesis specifically? I'm not sure that there's a right or wrong answer. I guess we all fall into the trap of looking at it through our own home movie. So mine was the tome, the doorstopper, that thankfully doesn't sit on a shelf, and maybe I'll come back to that a little bit later. I think it's had good use even as a 300-pager ultimately. But I think there's a strong argument to say, how does one make that more, accessible, more open source? How does one extract more value out of it not just in one's own individual journey, but I think for other researchers, for other students, how does one use the platform? Again, perhaps a point we can come back to a little bit later from a technological point of view. How does one use technology to make that information potentially more accessible? I think there's opportunities in that. So for me, the relevance is the age-old tradition, does that still stand? As you alluded to, the world in various quarters and institutions and geographies are shifting the thinking. And I think that makes for a valid and sensible debate.
Yeah, it's about dissemination as well, which we'll come back to. So I'll come back to you, Juliet. So maybe I should actually have started to ask you rather than what is the relevance, rather than how do you do it. But your views on what is the relevance of academic research before we even go into how we publish it.
So I think, it depends on your research discipline. So some research disciplines, at the moment, I think still requires what we call that fundamental basic research to fully understand. For example, in the biological sciences, there's still so much that we don't understand about the cell, far less a tissue or an organ or the entire body. And so for us, I think that's the challenge for us is right now there's a trend, not just in North America, but I think worldwide, that faculty and professors in academia should be doing more applied research. They want to see drug discoveries faster, et cetera. But there's still so much we don't understand about how the cell works. And that requires basic fundamental research. So as much as many of us would love to be doing really applied research that we can say to our families or our friends, look, this is going to help you with your particular cancer or your cardiovascular disease, we don't fully understand how all the proteins and the genes within a single cell interact with each other. And so to target any one protein without knowing what it fully does, can then have serious consequences and side effects on other biological processes. So that, I think, is a challenge for me and many others like me who want to embrace technology and we want to embrace applied research, but we recognize there is still so much we don't understand. Even from my research, we think we understood one thing, and then along comes a really creative student and turns everything upside down. And if we had made a drug, then what would that have led to, right? So it's something I think that we have to think about and consider when we're pushing ahead on some of these. Like, it depends on the research discipline and what you're studying. I think some disciplines are a lot more amenable to moving ahead faster and rapidly than others. Yep.
So what you're talking to, Juliet, is this idea that, of course, and I think that we would all be able to talk to our own research, and of course this is relevant, of course this is something that we want to disseminate, this is important, and how we do it is a different thing.
Exactly.
So I'm going to turn to you now, Angus, and we had a discussion earlier tonight about your own research and working on a thesis and the relevance of it. And I think that what Juliet just explained is that of course it's relevant. It's research that I want to put out there, but how do you do it? And is that so now I come back to that idea of writing a thesis. Is it relevant doing a thesis, or how do we do it?
Yeah, as I said to you, I think my own sort of research journey is not sits on the sort of boundaries of design, and it's very much focused on developing products, objects, things that are going to impact broader society. So that in itself is really important. That is the applied aspect in a sense. But at the same time, I can see the relevance of trying to understand the world deeply at the same time. So in terms of this debate about sort of the idea of obsolete or absolute, I'm a bit of a fence sitter because I think it's both. I think that in many ways the thesis as an institution has been around for a very, very long time, and this idea of a big massive document that sits on a bookshelf is problematic. And I think that even if you're doing amazing sort of discoveries, those discoveries have a practical relevance down the line. So I suppose it's about timelines in a sense. The fact that I'm still in the process of doing my own PhD, I can say and again I said this to you, it's not so much the end outcome, this tome. For me, the process of my own personal development along that journey has been incredibly important. Understanding how to really deeply engage with the topic over time, and realizing over time as you look at something that you can look at it in so many different ways, and it becomes so much clearer as you get to that light at the end of the tunnel.
We'll come back to that, because I think that's interesting, that journey and the skills that you acquire. But rather provocatively then, that idea of that tome that sits on that, and even actually articles being published, and I can see the defense of or each of the topics here, but whether we publish it as a thesis in one tome or whether we publish it as articles, does it, I'm turning to you now, Sean, does it have a value out there? You work in the industry, what's the value of what we do, whether it's the research that Juliet does, that of course has an impact in a particular way, so does the research that Angus does, but if it, where does it sit? How do you disseminate it?
Well, I think that's a valid challenge, and I think something that we should be pondering as in the world of academia. And perhaps I have the vantage point of being, as I said earlier on, a pracademic with one foot in both worlds. So what, again, I talk through my individual lens, I was able to do, so there is the thud factor, there is the doorstopper on a shelf, but we were able to take aspects of that and use it and apply it well. So I think Angus's point about, and Juliet's point about applied work, we were able to take, I guess, the findings, go back a step. It was a qualitative study with case organizations. So the case organizations were clients. So there was a within case and a cross case analysis using clients from across industry sectors. So already there was practical insight and contribution and validity from an incoming point of view. And then the interpretation, the learnings and the insights developed were turned into a method and a model and applied to the consulting practice. So we took sort of almost in parallel, took the dissertation and put it into practice in the business from a methodological and applied point of view. And then by extension, through that other foot in the world of academia, I've had several students who are supervised who have expressed an interest in the same topic area, who have been able to say, come and build on what are some of the recommendations for further research. So it's been quite multi-dimensional. And for me personally, apart from, and I agree with Angus, the journey, and not just, I think one of the statements about you spend a lot of time writing, but I think the richness of the wide reading and the depth and the exploration that you go through, I think there's a certain richness in that. And if one can then take that in a multi-dimensional way, break it up and apply it in different facets, then I think there's value beyond this thing that you look at 300 pages on a bookshelf. Yes, it's there and it's got that third factor value, but it has been broken out into value add in a number of different ways. And perhaps that's where we should be challenging the thesis, is what can you do beyond just that assessment and examination ultimately? How do you break that up and share it and disseminate it?
Yeah. So, and I mean, I think that's interesting, and I think that often we emphasize, that this, writing a thesis, or whether you write it as a thesis, or a set of articles, it's writing skills, it's research skills. These are very, skills that goes beyond actually the topic of what you're researching in a way. But if you really want to make your research, research is, of course, it's got to be relevant, but how do you, once again, then, you want to spread it. You want it to land in the communities that you work against, or whatever it might be. So what is it in that idea then of writing either a set of academic articles or that tome that might, even get published in one way or the other beyond, and wouldn't it be better, so let me put it this, would it be better that we publish our research as a series of opinion pieces whenever you make a new discovery in biology? Angus, wouldn't it be better that your, design ideas are implemented and tested in, some kind of, live setup? I don't know, but, I'm throwing out, Juliet, what do you say to that?
So I think that at least I can speak for McMaster and some of the universities and various communities in North America. There's definitely a recognition that we need to be engaging more with the communities that each of the universities actually is immersed in. So the immediate physical community and then the wider community. And so there's definitely a recognition of that, and more faculty and professors and students are getting more involved in what we call community engagement. So where we're going out into the communities and we're giving lectures or series of talks in lay terms about the research that we're doing and its relevance to society, which again helps with the justification for why the government should be spending all this money on academia and paying our salaries. And because I think that's where a lot of the disconnect has come, is that a lot of the work we do seems very abstract to many people in society. And so there's a lot of that, and even now some of us are asking or requiring our students to write a lay abstract as part of their thesis, which also forces them to think about the relevance of their work in the big picture. And I think that that's another way of disseminating the information in a way that's understandable to the general public, as well as to others outside of the field, say someone in physics or in chemistry who is not a biologist, so they can understand. And same thing with your work. Like if you can describe it in a way that we can all understand, then it's like, okay, now I understand how this is relevant. And then sometimes it might spark an idea. How can I use that idea in my research? So I think it's about, a lot of it is also dissemination, and as you said, developing excellent communication skills, whether it's written skills or oral skills. And so there's a big, I would say, push or trend towards that in many universities. Definitely at McMaster, we're very involved now in community engagement, making sure we go out into communities and talk about our research.
But does the thesis really do that? So I can see the writing doing,
The thesis, not necessarily, but that's why I think, as I said, like we're asking our students now to write lay abstracts, to do this more on an ongoing basis, not just when you write the thesis at the end of your degree, but throughout your degree. Many of our grant applications in Canada now require that every single grant application has to have a lay abstract that could be understood by a 12-year-old. So there's a genuine push to help us, or to force us, to make our work more relevant so that the general public understands, so they understand where the research funds or how they're being used in a way that's actually relevant and not so abstract that we're sitting in an ivory tower pontificating and it's not relevant to anyone. And so I think that's helped many scientists,
Yeah.
at least, I think, to alter their work in a way that's, that's actually applicable.
Sounds like a really fantastic model. Angus, could it work in the context of South Africa, the research that?
Well, I mean, look, the reality is that a lot of our work that at a master's and PhD level is very much embedded in community engagement and in communities. And I think you were asking about the implementation, and actually a lot of the time the postgraduate research is about implementing designs in reality and testing them and seeing how they work. Because conceptual work is all great on paper, but when you actually get it out into the real world and you throw in the reality of human relations and economics and ecology, things don't work out quite in the way that you plan. And so the practice, the practical outcome in many cases is out in the community. And the dissertation then documents that process. The thesis documents that process. So in a sense, the dissertation or the thesis is sort of the ends, but the means to get there is actually these various forms of practical implementation. So I mean, one of the examples, one of the projects that we did was working with a whole lot of small-scale farmers, working with experts, and developing this amazing beehive that increases honey production by 40%. And those hives, in the process of a master's, were implemented and have been used and are benefiting small-scale farmers in the diversification of their farming activities. And I think this is a really important thing, have now led into a business and into a commercial entity. And so this is now research that has gone into the business realm. So in terms of value, there is economic value in it. There is social value in the sense of the farmers themselves getting new income and a diversification. So I think there is a lot more in, and this is particular to the design discipline itself.
I can definitely see that, but do you have to write it up? Isn't it better that you go out and showcase it? But why do we still have that? The requirement that you have to write it up.
Well, maybe just to briefly respond, in the design disciplines, the requirement to write it up is becoming less and less. And there are practice-based PhDs that are offered internationally where the written component is a very small component. But you have to contextualize what you do, and you have to be able to explain why what you've done is so relevant. Why is it new knowledge, especially in the realm of a PhD?
Exactly.
And having an object sitting there and saying this is a PhD could be relatively problematic, especially if you took it out of context. So you need to contextualize, you need to embed what you've done in the place and space that it's been developed in. So the models are changing, and I mean there's also interesting PhDs by practice where people who have a set of things that they've developed and produced can take that as a portfolio and submit that as a PhD with a written component saying how this has really radically changed South African landscape, for example. We're not there yet in South Africa, but I think it is, in the world, these things are being questioned. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's all good in a sense. I still think that, isn't it so that we still sort of have a model that talks to, first you do the work. You do the research, which we have to do. Either way, the research it's going to be done, and it's going to be implementable, and it's going to have value in one way or the other. And we're sort of moving further and further away, as you said, Juliet, from that idea of an ivory tower, that actually we want research that is relevant and not only arts for art's sake, in a sense.
Yeah.
But I do think that how we then do it, and is there still sort of value in having people sitting writing it up and explaining it to an audience that might be very, very small, at the best a few examiners of a thesis, when actually, and connecting it back to the fourth industrial revolution, with new technology, we can disseminate research as it happens. We can actually sort of live stream our research findings, if you wish. I don't know. Sean, do you have any?
I had that thought running through my mind in preparation for tonight about what's that intermediate platform.
Yeah.
So I mean we're still at the moment trapped in writing. The debate is whether it's a thesis or whether it's published article. I think with some exceptions around practical work, evidence of practical work. But I was having that thought around what would the new dispensation look like? And I wonder whether anybody's having that debate right now, i.e., what's the digital platform that expresses this content? So, for example, could you have real-time data? I'm just thinking of Angus studying right now. As is in progress, could you have a dashboard with real-time data and perspectives of the work in progress or the current findings that are perhaps still pointing towards or leading to, a conclusion? Would that trigger some kind of almost crowdsourcing or crowd thinking? And I guess you have the debate then, who gets the credit? We'll come back to that perhaps a little bit later.
Exactly.
Is it Angus's work then, or is it the crowd's work? It's a
Yeah.
different dilemma. But could you almost, not necessarily open source it, but open share it, for want of a better word, where you're getting a work in progress update and review, so you're getting faster access to his thinking and his work stream right now, and that the ultimate presentation, you may still have a written component, but that your ultimate report is this robust piece of work, but on a digital platform, and that could be quite multidimensional. It could have, quite gory statistical data. It could have qualitative insights. It could have infographics. It could have video content from the field. So it could be quite multidimensional in its format, but on the tech platform. So embracing the 4.0 thinking.
And I think this is really interesting, and I'm just looking at some of the feeds coming through from our online audience, and Teddy is saying just that, and I think that talks to a lot of the debates here, that it's all about dissemination, Yes, and Teddy says, I really like the point that if the thesis have a social and economic value to the society, it's bound to cause change and impact to the society, but only if well disseminated. And the question is then, how do we do that best? And I'm wondering, once again, and I'm stressing that point, why do we still require students? Juliet, you're in Toronto.
Why do we require them to write a thesis?
Yeah.
I think at least I can speak for myself and for some of my colleagues, part of it is ensuring that the student has read the published literature, as we said, because we don't want someone plagiarizing or reporting on something that's already been done and claiming it as theirs. So one component or one reason is we would like to ensure that our trainees are actually reading the literature, seeing what's published, and then thinking about what are the unfilled needs or unmet needs, what is that outstanding question that no one has actually tackled. And the only way you can do that is through reading the literature and then synthesizing it, writing a synopsis and putting it into your thesis. Or maybe they can put it into a review article. So I guess my question was, are you suggesting that instead of the students write this big fat 300-pager, they should write smaller articles that are more, as we would say, chewable or edible to the general public and other academics? Is that what you're suggesting or would like to see us doing rather than a 300-page thesis?
No,
because I'm all for that.
Yeah,
I like smaller
I
bite-sized pieces myself.
It's an interesting thing, and this connects. Sorry, Juliet, but it connects back to what you said earlier, Sean, as well, when we talk about then new platforms for disseminating research. So actually, an online, feed here from Tomcats in KZN says that, what is it that, couldn't we use open source instead? Isn't that the research that, dissemination that we could do better rather than,
I think there has been, I don't remember the name of I know that some of my colleagues have started using this platform where before they even submit their articles now for publication, I just don't remember the name of the website, but you can actually submit your article in preparation, and you get feedback from other scientists that are just going to read it and say, okay, this is great, you missed this control, have you thought about doing this experiment? So you get this immediate feedback that then you can go back and really improve your article before it's published.
ResearchGate.
Is it ResearchGate?
I think it's ResearchGate.
There's another one as well. There's a different one that my
Okay.
colleague is using. I just can't remember the name right now. And so some faculty have started, at least in the biomedical area, I don't know if anyone else is using it in other disciplines, but definitely in the biomedical field, some of my colleagues have started doing that. And they felt it's been very useful for their research. Others are concerned that folks will steal their ideas. So this is part of the challenge, and we were talking as well.
Tom Cat from KZN actually says that.
Exactly.
Isn't there a threat of theft?
Exactly. And also we were talking earlier about performance indicators. Then how do we measure, because I think then the entire academy needs to change how it assesses every faculty member as well as students. If we go, like it will require a major overhaul, I think, of the academy.
Major overhauls might not be a bad thing.
We're heading into a disruptive era.
Exactly,
So,
and that is that's the
Yeah.
whole idea. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about disruption, and the fourth industrial revolution brings with it some disruptions, and I think that the technology is there to actually disseminate research in much better ways, and. But maybe, I don't know, Angus, you're busy, I know, writing a PhD thesis as we speak. And
I'm surprised you could be here
I know,
tonight.
I'm like, what are you doing
You should be
here?
busy.
But now you have a platform here
mental
to
break.
disseminate it all. No, but Angus, if you think about your own journey, and we talked a little bit, and you mentioned it earlier on the panel as well, that you feel that there are certain skills that have come with actually sitting, writing it up and letting that process take its own course,
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think I think in some ways, the difficulty of almost like constantly sharing your work is that actually sometimes in the writing, it's almost like you've got to get things out of your head. And you actually don't really want to share that stuff until you get to a point that you've really figured these things out. And I mean, that's really what a PhD is.
Yeah.
You're dealing with, in the design, we talk about this idea of wicked problems. And wicked problems are, that's what a PhD in design is. You're looking at something that, like, the minute you think you understand it, it shifts and it moves. And you're talking about the cell that you thought you understood, and the student says, well, let's look at it differently, and it doesn't behave that way.
Yeah.
And that's what this kind of research is. So, in some ways, yes, you want to get feedback, and it is happening. I think, we find there are design discussion platforms, there's things like ResearchGate, and for certain aspects you discuss and you engage. But, to share it, and this also comes into this idea of theft. Universities also have these tech transfer offices that are trying to manage intellectual property, and it's a bit of a cat and mouse, because you want to manage intellectual property so that you can actually commercialize it. And if you don't protect it, you're not going to get the funders to take it out and to actually massify it, to get it out into the real world. At the same time, when you try to protect it, you've got to keep it, and you've got to keep it to yourself for like a very long time, because it takes time to get all the paperwork in place. So we have students, some of them who have a very open source model, where they've used platforms like Kickstarter to fund the actual development and design of their products to take it out. But then the intellectual property itself is something that is relatively open source in the first place. And at the other scale, we've got students that have developed incredible technologies that can have mass impact. I was talking about the reusable sanitary pad, which is something that now has been patented and has to be kept under wraps until the point that we can actually get it into commercialization. But the impact, the potential impact of it, it could be massive. But in order to enable it to have that impact, you need to protect
So
it.
I can see the need for keeping some research under wrap, but that does not necessarily solve or answer the question to, is it necessary to keep writing it up?
Right. So it's the writing up that you're struggling with.
Yes. I mean, and I think, it's an interesting thing. So Michelle says online, as a young academic, I wonder if this perhaps isn't related to the lack of incentives there are for academics to make the research available to the general public. And of course, I think that, as I do think that as, whether you're a, emerging scholar or not, you want to get your research out there, but how do you do it in the best way? And also, there's a sense here that maybe we are not doing enough to disseminate our research. I don't think that anyone is necessarily complaining about the writing up, whichever way we do it. But, how do we get it out there? And for young academics, it's important to get it out there.
Yeah.
So maybe we should have, instead of saying you have to publish a thesis or 3 articles or whatever it might be, maybe we should say, you have to make sure that your research lands where it's supposed, where it does the most benefit, where it has the most impact, rather. I don't know, Sean.
So it's proven, I suppose, that's a result-based or output-based contribution.
Yeah.
But I'm just, in my own thought process, just coming back to, are we not also just putting too much emphasis on the process on the pain of writing? Because as we were chatting about earlier on, there's lots of other dimensions that go into it. So there's extensive reading, which we agreed is stimulating. It's mind-opening and enhancing in so many ways. There's the process of or understanding methodological approaches. So there's a set of rigor that goes into that. There's the learning the art of data gathering, the art of data analysis, and sort of interpretation. So it's almost, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. We're preoccupying with the pain of writing, but again, there's other dimensions that go into this process that fill that 6 years quite easily. So perhaps the argument around writing is about how do we report it. So it doesn't. So maybe it's in the report conversation. Should it only be in a written format, or again coming back to the platform, could this platform be repurposed in such a way that it could be a lot more dynamic, a lot more engaging? But in my mind, without detracting from the robustness of those other steps that we follow, because for me, the health warning of being totally digital in this is we don't want to have the Twitter or Facebook version of PhD, because we see the vitriol and fake news that goes out with social media. You don't want to suddenly put a PhD into a social media equivalent. For all its positives, you don't want to do that to the quality of the process either.
And that comes back to what Juliette talked about earlier, that actually the value here is not only, the content of the research itself, is also the process of verification. Of,
and my students say this every time. They go, oh my goodness, I just read this. I wish I had read this 3 years earlier or 2 years earlier. It would have changed how I designed my experiment, right? So there are all these soft skills, as we call them, that go into working on your thesis and then writing your thesis ultimately at the end. And without that, so as you said, maybe I think what we're all saying is we would like a different way of reporting our final PhD or master's thesis data. But the question is 5 3-page articles? Like, I don't know. I don't think we can set some kind of finite format. As you said, I like the idea of having various formats. Video,
and is the published article, sorry to interrupt, is the published article necessarily it?
Exactly.
Could it be another format?
Exactly, which I think some universities are also tending towards. So some places are beginning to think about these alternate ways of submitting a thesis.
But I think the credibility aspect is really important. And I mean, even though the South African government at the moment are considering this idea of creative production, so the idea of making something and you can get sort of it's considered a research output, still that has to go through a peer review process. So even though you've made something, you've still got to write it up. You've still got to send it to a peer review, and the peer reviewer still has to look at it. Somebody who's an expert to be able to say, yeah, this is amazing. So, I mean, writing aside, there are other problematics in our context, and the first thing is also it's writing in English, and that in itself is relatively problematic in the sense that it limits the language of conversation. It also alienates a lot of our students, particularly at UJ. But the global language of research tends to be English. And I mean, we've recently got a new academic in our department from Chile, and it's incredible the amount of research that's been written in Spanish that I have never accessed on design, but he's been able to bring into the department. So there is a problematic in the sense that research is only presented in English in this written format and only disseminated in that way.
But thanks to the digital world, machine learning should be able to translate all of that right now, right, and expedite that for us, and maybe even synthesize it and give us some Twitter versions.
Give us a one-page infographic.
Exactly.
I think that's hugely important, because that also connects to what you were talking about, Juliette, about writing an abstract that can be read by anyone, and that language comes in there as well, and it should be easy enough. And we do talk about that, particularly here at the University of Johannesburg, that we actually want to translate into at least abstracts into a couple of more languages. But I think it goes further than that. And coming back to then, we've talked about, the value in the thesis. So there's the value of, the research itself, and that needs to be disseminated to the right audience and to the communities, or to, the community where it should be making an impact. But there's then the skills of writing a thesis that, the research skills, of course, of being a researcher, writing it up is a process in and of itself. There's value in research processes of verification and so on. But all of this does not take away from, actually, shouldn't we, and in light of actually the fourth industrial revolution, also acquiring new skills through the research process? And one of those will be dissemination through new platforms, for example, but also to be able then to use this platform to actually, communicate research in ways that whether it's a language translation that's needed, or explaining something in a lay language, or actually using technology to actually inculcate or to disseminate, to have research being disseminated in the communities where it should make an impact. What role can technology play in those spaces? Silence. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think that definitely in the design field, even in the arts, at the end of an arts-based thesis, you have an exhibition. That's a public event. The work is exhibited. The public are invited. Anybody can come and see the work. It gets mentioned in the press. It gets publicized in popular press. I think a lot of our students have also been using this as a means to also potentially set themselves up for further business opportunities going forward. Yeah. So I can see that might be a bit more difficult for somebody to say, wow, check, I've figured out this amazing cell something or other, and everybody's like, what on earth are you talking about? But
that's been the challenge for us, and for me, it has taught me a lot about how to simplify things.
Yeah.
Right? Now that we've put this in place for the most part at most of the federal funding agencies, it has really challenged all of us to think about what we're doing and how we talk to the public. And I think most of us would admit that it's made us better scientists.
Yeah.
So it actually, initially folks were upset and they're angry, it's another bit of work we have to do. But ultimately it's led to many of us thinking, this is good. It's helping me to think about, how is this relevant? Why is it relevant? Who am I talking to? How do I explain this using a traffic light? So now a lot of my talks, I use very, very lay language depending on who I'm talking to. And I use situations and scenarios that everyone could relate to. A traffic light, someone knocking at your door, this is the signal, someone knocks at your door, you hear the sound, you come from the kitchen, you open the door, that's signal transduction. So then I relate it back to some scientific term. So it actually helps, if that makes sense.
I hear you, Julie. And I mean, that talks to how you then, as a researcher, have come to some kind of insight about, I need to disseminate my research, and how do I do it best, and how do I talk to people, and how do I get it out there? And I'm thinking, Sean, you're a branding expert. Isn't it so that we academics in general are quite lousy at branding themselves and their research?
No,
and
we're not.
How should we do that?
No, I think it's an interesting point, and perhaps there is a case for that, sort of building around. I think I love Angus's idea about an exhibition, and maybe we should have, again, bring sort of connecting the dots here of, if you make that a new requirement for submission of a dissertation, to make that a requirement that you need to now submit and defend in the context of this new digital platform. And part of that is to visually display information in an interesting way that you're exhibiting scientific findings by discipline. So the disciplines will differ, the dimensions will differ, but that your abstract takes on a whole new meaning. It becomes this digital exhibit that's on display, which also, I'm coming back to the point of branding, also makes a connection back to how we brand our research outputs, whether I'm an individual or part of a faculty or part of an institution. It also pulls that lever a little bit about that profile building and dissemination component of what we have on offer, but to do it in a more digitally relevant, interesting and engaging way.
And I mean, but we discuss this a lot within the academy, but more than also just teaching our disciplines. We want to teach, or we want to find ways of actually fostering creativity, innovation, collaborative skills, all of these things that comes actually with contemporary life and actually the world of work in our societies is changing, and we want different skills. So you wonder then, once again, the thesis, is that the best way of fostering these skills? Or are there better ways of, with the research process also actually then, thinking about how we foster creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship around, in our degree structures and the way we do things. And I don't know that,
I think I go back to your point of, in some ways, it's forcing that dimension. It's forcing the researcher in the modern context to say you have to embrace the technology, and this becomes a requirement of how you go through the process. I mean, we're talking about the end result, but even just the power of technology in, for example, the analytics. I mean, that's transformative in every sense of the word.
in comparison, if you just look at the tools that are available from an analytical point of view. So that's quite game changing. Also, the idea of this whole 4.0 triggering new areas for research.
Yeah.
You know, I think we've spoken a lot about that in terms of higher education and how faculties are having to reinvent. But I think there's a whole body of new topics and territories for researchers across disciplines to explore. I'm straying off your
No,
point here a little bit.
but that's also
But
important,
yeah,
of course.
just joining disruptive dots here, I
Yeah.
think it becomes an interesting space. Yeah.
No, for sure, absolutely, and I think that as you say, research is changing as well. So it's not only how, firstly how we do research, how we carry out the research even before any thoughts of disseminating that research is of course changing, and the topics, as you say, and there's always related to an idea of the changing societal processes as a whole, and paradigmatic changes that the fourth industrial revolution brings with it. But then also how do we disseminate, and how do we also teach students to, I would think that it's all about using social media, and we said that there are pitfalls with social media, but maybe so we should learn how to use social media better to disseminate our research. I don't know. I guess how can we do that?
Well, I find it quite interesting that a lot of our students are actually rejecting social media. They're finding it too disruptive in their existence, and so I think that technology is not necessarily the be-all and the end-all, and I know that this is an Industry 4.0 discussion, but the reality is that we're entering Society 4.0, and in many cases the technology is impacting on the society, and we haven't yet, we were having this discussion outside, we don't even know the impact of much of the technology on our broader social fabric. And those are opportunities for study and for and for deep study to really understand. And the problematics are that technology itself is shifting so quickly that to actually study the impacts of the technology on society is not that easy. So disseminating research is one thing, but then being able to study technology that is moving at such a rapid pace and how it's going to be changing the way that we live is another thing altogether as well. And that links to the problematics of the fact that the PhD is a sort of 4-year monster, and by the time you finish the 4 years, you realize, hang on, it's obsolete. And they say that by the time our students graduate, what they've been prepared for is no longer what the world needs them to be able to do.
But the point is, wouldn't it be less obsolete, Juliet, if we sort of shared our research? And as a scientist, you're probably more used to this idea of,
Yeah, so we share our research at conferences on a yearly basis. So that's, for us, that's not the challenge. But I think, as you said, Angus, regarding your students rejecting social media, the problem with social media, at least for me when I dabble in it, is it's like a black hole. Once you go on and you start tweeting or doing anything, 2 hours has passed and you're like, what? 2 hours is gone, and you can't get those 2 hours back. You still have to now go do your experiments or do your research. We're still, at the end of the day, there's still only 24 hours a day. The human brain, unlike a computer, needs to actually power down and rest. So I think that's also a challenge that the fourth industrial revolution is going to have, as you said, back to the impact on humans, on humanity. We haven't discussed that much here, but I think that's a bigger question, and a more challenging question is how are we going to integrate that with humanity as a whole, and the fact that there's going to be inequities and inequalities with some of this technology being used by some societies better than others, some communities better than others. We already see that there are many in the developing countries that haven't developed very far, and how is this going to help or augment their growth and their development? So for me, that's my concern about the rapid rate and the exponential rate at which this is happening. It's happening so fast that many communities and countries are going to be left behind. And so to what end is that, if we're supposed to be doing this as academics for the greater good of humanity and society, if we're leaving millions of people behind in the wake of all of this revolution, right? Like, I think, I don't know. It's a deeper philosophical question.
Of course it is, and
but one that I think we need to be
Sorry,
discussing.
absolutely.
No, you didn't stir. We discussed this before. We were discussing this
There
outside.
is sort of a balance then to be found by, on the one hand, what you pointed out, Angus, that if we spend 4 years on writing a research thesis, but by the time we get to publish our results, it's within that research time frame, it's obsolete, it's too old, it's outdated. vis-a-vis then, the fears that you raised, Juliet, a little bit, that, but if we constantly are going to, whether it's tweeting about our research or trying to write it up in shorter sort of pieces or, whatever it might be, opinion pieces maybe, that it swallows a lot of time and we get caught up in that rather than, promoting. I don't know, but it's a balance here between a different set of skills. And I think that's a little bit what you touched upon, Sean, that, what are these skills and how do we do it? And, is it an either or scenario?
I suppose that end result is, thinking back to something I think Juliet said right at the outset, what is the expectation? The expectation of that PhD is to make a contribution and advance knowledge. And you're not going to do that in short form code and fancy Twitter posts. In much the same way that we also say to students, you're not going to be able to come and do a really great presentation and sell it verbally. That's part of a process, but at the end of the day, it's the rigor and the discipline that's on display in that final written analysis that I think is still so meaningful and contributory to, I guess, validating the findings. For me, I think what would be interesting is how can one, if it's a 7-year process or a 6-year process, can the technology shorten that cycle? Can we better use 4.0 to, without detracting from quality and rigor, but can we somehow compact this? Pressures of life notwithstanding, but is there some way we can shorten that cycle so that we don't have that, perhaps, that irrelevance at the end of a 7-year period, or that challenge with the speed of things? So it could be speeded up, I guess, is perhaps another dimension to it.
Get a robot to write my PhD.
Exactly.
Or you could just dictate it.
To write it for me.
Transcribe it.
But there are research tools that, of course, makes it easier, and maybe who can shorten that span then of time. If we can use the tools to our advantage, and of course, that's
just to interject. Definitely, that's what we thought. We were discussing this as well. We thought the advent of computers would have generated a paperless society. We'd all be more efficient and productive, but everyone's busier. So that goes back to what we were saying about studying the impact of all of these technologies on human life and society, right? So I think that's something, because I think of, an experiment that I did as a graduate student. Took me a week to do it, and now literally I just take the DNA, I send it to a service provider, and within 2 days I get the result back. But the expectation is now that I will do 10 more experiments because I have more time. So it's trying to figure out how do we balance this, right?
There's always something to fill the gap in terms of,
exactly.
I think that, and that's also what's being discussed now online is actually this idea that can technology help us speed up certain processes, and whether it's the research itself or whether it's the dissemination processes or, the lifespan of things. But I mean, we're talking about, this idea of is the academic thesis an absolute or is it obsolete? And of course, research will also always be an absolute. We won't advance on anything unless we have proper research to underpin what we implement, in communities. And Angus, you've talked a little bit about that, and the relevance. I think we all agree to the absolute also of relevance. So the question is then, can we make it an absolute within our criteria for how we graduate students and how we assess students, that actually they have to, not only does the research have to have relevance, but it has to be disseminated so that relevance can be proven in one way or the other, in a societal context or a community context, for example. Would that work? Would it be a feasible criteria for
I think that's feasible and reasonable to request.
I think the challenge would be to get alignment around the principle, just given the nature of the different disciplines and faculties and institutions. Even in the current context, there's so much variation of approach. I mean, the idea, I think, is a great one. I think the challenge will be in...
It could be an absolute.
As I said, and it's going to come back to the fact that some research is incredibly fundamental and doesn't have any applied relevance at that. So then the challenge becomes really thinking about explaining it in a way that the general public understands that, yes, this is really fundamental, but without it, we cannot do that next major applied thing. Which is feasible, right? I think it is feasible regardless of your discipline. It just requires a lot more creativity.
So, if we can, we can talk about some of those absolutes then, I mean, relevance, I think, should be an absolute. And as you say, it's difficult how you maybe set up criteria. And that will also vary, I imagine, between disciplines as well, how you, and Angus, you talked a little bit about that earlier, that, if you're in a practice-based discipline, for example, of course, those criteria are going to be slightly different from other disciplines, maybe, and those are also, but also in a practice-based discipline, I imagine that the skills that you acquire or want your students to acquire through writing a thesis or doing a thesis or doing a research project are different from other disciplines, more theory-based disciplines, for example. But then what is it that's obsolete here? So coming back to that idea of a practice-based discipline, maybe wasn't the writing sort of, wasn't that isn't that obsolete already in a practice-based discipline?
Well, I mean, obsolete means like it's completely irrelevant, where for me it's not completely obsolete. It just, maybe it needs to be reconsidered. I mean, it needs to be reconsidered, and possibly in terms of a 300-page tome that is going to be read in terms of its introduction and conclusion, and everything in between is almost skimmed over. But I think that there has to be some kind of contextualization, deep contextualization of whatever it is that has been done, and whether that is through a video, somebody presenting and arguing, almost following the Vivo model without a written aspect. I think there could be creativity in the way that that's disseminated, but I don't know whether or not watching a 2-hour video of a student explaining why their PhD is amazing versus a written document. I think it's just a different form of communication. But I don't think that it could just be an individual item, an individual thing. I think it has to be embedded and it has to be examinable in some way or other as well.
There's got to be evidence to substantiate the argument or the finding.
Yeah, because this is what exists before, this is what I've done, and this is how I've changed the body of knowledge forward. Without being able to understand what's come before, you might be just repeating the wheel. And I think that's an important aspect of what the PhD is all about.
Yeah. But that can, once again, then be communicated in various ways. And I think that, Juliet, you really made a point about that idea of a lay. In lay terms, in lay language, how do we, and the question is then what platforms do we have at our disposal to do so? And I think it will be interesting to see actually, and how well can we do it, and how well then, can we brand it, and brand our research to actually get it out there and to make it, make it have impact and make it impactful.
So in South Africa, have you tried the 3-minute thesis?
Yeah, we do.
And do you find that effective? Do the students find that effective?
I mean, I think it's effective in the sense that it provides an opportunity for students to really hone in on what is the central thesis here, what is unique, what is the what is my main argument, but maybe that's something to consider. So, but that 3-minute thesis, can it be adaptable then to actually also then, once the research is done, to put that in, package it, to make it clear to a wider public what the relevance is of research.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
So I was just thinking of the point that Angus made. It got me thinking about in progress dissemination. Use that analogy of, well, before I got here, there was this body of work. And that could be an example of something that the prior body of work is an example of something that could be packaged to say, I'm studying this interesting new territory, but let me put out a short-term dissemination on this platform of what I found in this territory thus far. That's not really giving anything away. It's alluding to an existing body of work, some possible gaps in thinking and opportunity. That might be a way to take an in-progress chunk and put it out there.
I mean, I also think that one of the things to think about is, one of the other important aspects of the thesis is also the getting that person into the world, this knowledgeable person into the world. And so, I mean, one of the interesting ways to explore, taking the exhibition more public, if you could have things like sort of biology fairs, where you go to schools and you show, look at these amazing things that we've been exploring. Because I think that also the reality is that the world has become so complex that for scholars coming out of school who have to learn 7 subjects and then choose what they're going to be doing for the rest of their lives. Like, if I had somebody come and show me some amazing sort of biology experiment at school, I might be a biologist now as opposed to a designer. But it's things that inherently you experience along the way
Yep.
that end up
Yep.
sort of directing you towards what you end
Exactly.
up doing. And so in some ways I think it's about also taking that knowledge and then embedding it back into our society. And at the foundation of our society is our youth.
Yep.
So if we can take the body of knowledge back into the youth in some way, practically how,
Yep.
I think that would be the most important thing to explore.
And I think that one of the points, and Dimitri makes this point online, that it's about harnessing technology to disseminate research and to do research in ways that are makes it impactful and in efficient ways, I guess, And I think this is important. And Teddy actually says that surely giving or sharing bits is important, and that's what it is about. I think. I don't think that we can, make any clear judgments on, absolute or obsolete. I think that we can all say that the absolute here is to, good research, and to make it impactful and make it relevant.
And be relevant, I
And
think.
be
Make the
relevant.
contribution in a relevant way. I think that's
Yeah.
vital. That's
Yeah.
an absolute, yeah.
And I think that's the important message here. And I think that, ways of how we do it might be obsolete in one way or the other, they are changing rather, but the absolute will always be about the relevance and how well we can disseminate it and make it impactful.
Yeah.
I think that's the
Yep.
we're all in agreement
agreement.
on that. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very, very much, and I want to thank you all at home as well. You've been fantastic, and it's been lovely seeing the feeds. And it's always, and I this is something that the panel won't be aware of, but I see the discussion that goes on online between the different people have tuned in, and I continue that because I think that's absolutely fantastic, and how you respond to each other and so on. That's it's lovely to see. But I want to thank you very, very much for coming out this evening and to participate with us here at the University of Johannesburg in these debates that we will continue. And there's so much to be said, not only about the academic research, but the whole, the academic system itself and higher education in the fourth industrial revolution. And we will continue these debates for sure. So
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you very much.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks to all that tuned in.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks.